Warpugs. So today we're going to check out something from Drachinifel. If I know I'm butchering his name, but this is on the Mark 14 Torpedo, and what little I know about the Mark 14 Torpedo is that it's the torpedo that we had initially at the beginning of World War II, and it didn't work. And people knew it wasn't going to work, but bypassed it anyway just to save money. That's what I know about the Mark 14. Now, I could be dead wrong. I have been told that this is going to irritate the crap out of me. I don't... Yeah, it's going to be a thing that's going to bother me. This has been requested for a very, very long time. And recently it was requested by When Dawn Rises, but this has been requested for, like, before I split the request channels. This was on the Discord. So I don't know why it's taking me this long, but here we are. Throw rocks at me later. Let's go. I do know he has a little bit up front. There we go. Let's go. Here we go.
Ah, yes. The Mark 14 Torpedo. So many questions. Who invented the Mark 14? What was the Mark 14? Why was the Mark 14? Well, the origins of the Mark 14 torpedo are actually relatively unremarkable. The US Navy had a perfectly serviceable torpedo in the shape of the Mark 10, which dated from World War I. But this weapon had a number of shortcomings by the time of the early 1930s. Its near quarter-ton warhead was substantial, but newer capital ships had been designed to withstand worse. Its effective range and speed were also now best described as uncomfortably close and pedestrian, with a number of destroyers in many navies coming into service ostensibly having top speeds that were flat out faster than the Mark 10.
Ain't that fun?
Meaning that a simple turn away and run for a few thousand yards would be a 100% guaranteed escape for these vessels, and some cruisers were not much slower.
Huh.
The introduction of the newer, larger fleet submarines meant that, whilst the 21-inch diameter would be kept, the torpedo tubes themselves could be made longer to accommodate a longer torpedo, which would then have more fuel and a more advanced engine, as well as an extra crewman's body weight in explosives. Design work would start in 1931 and would eventually yield a weapon capable of travelling almost 3 times as far as the Mark 10 when it was going at similar speeds, or around 1,000 yards further than the older weapon at substantially higher speeds.
Okay.
Other work was being done to try and improve the speed at which the torpedo would actually level out at its design cruising depth, as well as further work ensuring that the gyroscope, which was a key part of keeping the torpedo going in a straight line, remained powered throughout its journey. Whereas a number of ships in World War I had either gone down or been sent packing by a single torpedo hit due to either relatively or, in some cases, completely lacking underwater protection, by now newer ships had extensive torpedo defence systems, and even older vessels were being refitted with bulges.
I just love the fact that the concept of things called belts were put together just strictly for taking torpedo hits. That's how prevalent submarine warfare was back then.
This in turn meant that torpedoes had to evolve. You could of course pack in more boom, which was always a good thing, but the weapon itself had size restrictions even in the newer subs. So you could try the new technique that had been derived from observations of underwater explosions in World War I, especially those of German so-called magnetic mines, which had been borne out in subsequent testing in the early 1920s, and that was to go for an under-keel detonation. Whilst this is a fundamental part of modern torpedo design, back in the interwar period it was brand new and also faced a rather considerable problem. All torpedoes at this point had used contact detonators, but a torpedo running deeper under the target's keel would of course not hit anything.
The concept of hitting the keel, if you don't know, the keel is essentially in shipbuilding, they lay the keel first. It is the backbone of the ship. It is the primary reinforcing element of the ship. If you break the keel, the ship's done. The ship is absolutely done.
So how would you set one off in the right place? The solution appeared to be the rather bluntly named Mark VI Exploder. This was a new kind of detonator that did not rely on physical contact, but rather the change in magnetic field created by the ferrous metals that made up the hull and major internal systems of modern warships.
Mm-hmm.
When the weapon passed into this magnetic disturbance, it would trigger the detonator. It seemed a perfect solution, and other navies were indeed working on similar devices. The Germans had started the trend with the aforementioned mine, but the British were also working on a similar detonator. It was at this point, however, that problems would first start to develop.
Hooray!
Work on the Mark VI was viewed paradoxically as an absolute top-secret technology, despite the fact that it was inspired by what was, at the time, a decade-old technology that had been used by another nation. This paranoia ran to the point that once the manual describing how the new detonator worked was actually written, it was then locked away in a safe where nobody who could actually use the thing in service would ever be able to access it, presumably in a basement behind a sign saying "Beware of the Leopard." Further issues would arise during testing. Tests by each...
This is seriously going to be one of those where I'm just sitting there wondering how in the hell a whole bunch of people that are supposed to be intelligent manage to screw this up this badly. This is seriously about to be one of those.
Each nation on their own magnetic detonation devices took place in, well, the areas of the ocean that they happened to have access to, shockingly enough.
Okay.
And this meant that the sensitivity of the detonator and the relative change in the magnetic field that was induced by a ship's hull was relevant only to that and a few similar areas of the world, which was something that would come back to haunt all navies who tried to use this technology in the early part of World War II. This was because the magnetic field of the Earth is not, in fact, constant all over the planet. It varies by location, especially by latitude, but local geological makeup and sometimes even the time of year can also affect this field strength. This could therefore result in a torpedo that was configured in one location but live fired elsewhere, either not functioning at all as a weaker magnetic field would not activate the detonator, or else explode far too soon as a stronger field would trip the detonators almost the moment they were active. The former issue would largely plague the Germans, and the latter issue would largely affect the British until workarounds were established during the Second World War. But, since this was not yet a known factor, the US Navy happily gathered information based on testing around the equatorial regions of the world, and would develop the sensitivities of the Mark VI Exploder based on this data.
A lot of things in the ocean, like, some people don't understand how, like, many factors you have to actually look at when it goes to the ocean. Salinity is one. Salinity is a massive one. But, like you said, even the magnetic fields are going to be different depending on where you are. There's actually rivers in the ocean, if you didn't know. Rivers of different flow and current. There's eddies, there's layers. The ocean is a huge ordeal to actually explain in any short-term way. That's why people, when they're going to sonar school, learn about propagation paths and different ways that you use sound waves, because the way the sound moves through water, and also how the ocean itself is oriented, and drop-off levels, things like that, because it's all different. It's crazy how complex the ocean actually is. Because if you don't think about it, I mean, you never would consider how much goes into just putting together a simple plan for a sonar ping.
Once these investigative test runs were done, the new Mark XIV torpedo promised to be a new and lethal addition to the US Navy's arsenal. With the first production torpedoes being rolled out, all that was left was a few full live-fire tests to determine that all the various systems that had been thrown together were working as intended, in sync with each other. But here, Congress's determination to throttle the US Navy out of every loose nickel and dime came to the fore.
Great.
As well as the somewhat disjointed relationship between various boards of development, all of which ostensibly were working for the same goal. The Navy itself offered an old destroyer that was destined for scrap as a target, but they didn't want the additional expense of having to refloat it and the loss of scrap value that blowing large parts of it off would entail, and so they insisted that the Bureau of Ordnance pay for any such costs that were involved in the testing of what they saw as the Bureau of Ordnance's torpedo. BUORD declined to pay out, and so the live-fire tests were never actually done. There was also the cost of the weapon itself. At $10,000 per torpedo, in 1930s money, each weapon cost almost as much as a then brand new F-2F fighter. And once delivered, the USN was somewhat reluctant to blow up such an investment unless they absolutely had to.
Right.
And so it was directed that any tests that might be done in the future would not use a live warhead, but instead a dummy warhead made of balancing weights was installed purely to ensure that the torpedo remained balanced on its run and didn't act like a gigantic explosive porpoise. Coupled with this were issues involving actually getting enough torpedoes out there to the fleet in the first place. Whilst they were a munition, a torpedo is far more complex and took far longer to build than a shell for a naval gun,
True.
even a battleship shell. Torpedoes, remember, are effectively small self-guiding kamikaze submarines, and so unless you have a large factory and an extensive production line going, you're only going to see handfuls produced each year. After experiencing serious problems in World War I, having received, in the course of the entire war, only enough torpedoes for a couple of major engagements, the US Navy had invested heavily in expanding torpedo production, especially in anticipation of the vast numbers of torpedoes that would be needed by the Clemson swarm and their leaders, the Omaha-class cruisers. But the Washington Naval Treaty had seen most of that particular fleet sent into reserve or to the scrapyard, as well as general funding pretty much collapse, and so several $1 million of investment in torpedo production went away almost as fast as the factory had been constructed. All this meant that by the 1930s there was precisely one factory capable of designing, building and testing torpedoes.
Yay.
Which also meant that no one was around who could check on the claimed performance of the Mark 14, despite the rather obvious bias that the manufacturer would have in reporting, namely that, of course, everything was absolutely perfect.
Yeah.
The small budgets that were available also meant small orders, which would mean fewer machines and fewer workers, and so even as the US Navy began to pick up the pace of construction as the 1930s rolled on and began to order more and more torpedoes, the bemused factory found itself struggling to keep up with the increasing demand and expand at the same time.
I was told this was going to irritate the hell out of me. It's doing a good job so far. It's doing a really good job so far. Imagine just... they designed a weapon. They don't know if it works. They don't know what it does, but let's just make a whole bunch of them, stick them on ships anyway. We've never live fired it. We've never tested it.
With orders coming in for submarine
This is
torpedoes,
why-
destroyer torpedoes, aerial torpedoes, and torpedoes suitable for PT boats, a rather large backlog began to build, with torpedo production averaging just over half a dozen of all types combined every week. And even by the late 1930s, as the factory had hit its expansion limits, a backlog of hundreds and then thousands of torpedoes was opening up. This, in turn, left the US Navy even more hesitant than ever to risk losing even one of the precious Mark 14 stock in any kind of live-fire test. Emergency measures were taken towards the end of the decade. The old factory the US Navy had briefly run during and shortly after World War I that had been shuttered was restarted after some rather clever political manoeuvring by the US Navy, as the first attempt to do so was blocked by politicians who were more concerned with their re-election than the national interest, and who were therefore determined just to keep torpedo production in their particular state.
Hooray!
This end run, opening the factory, managed to bring production levels up to a mighty 3 torpedoes per day. Again,
This makes me lose faith in humanity. This really, really does.
against a US Navy target of 50 per day.
Right.
As Europe descended into war, more money and 24/7 production was unlocked, but the production rate would still remain at less than half the targeted rate. In desperation, the US Navy began contracting out to various other companies, including the car maker Pontiac, the American Can Company, who really missed a trick building frigates, as well as a combine harvester maker, and a number of other companies of increasingly implausible titles when it comes to, well, weapons of warfare.
Right.
Then, of course, war came to American soil in the form of the Kido Butai's early morning wake-up call to Pearl Harbor, and they rather inconsiderately managed to blow up over 200 of the carefully husbanded Mark 14s in the process. All of this meant that as American submarines surged out from various ports into their first major battle, which was to save, or at least stall, the Imperial Japanese assault on the Philippines, they were using a weapon that had never actually been tested in live firing, of which they had precious few in the first place, and for which the instruction manual for the most sensitive and technically advanced part of the device was slowly collecting mildew in a safe on the other side of the Pacific.
That is the thing that irritates me just the absolute most about this. That's the part that irritates me the most about this. They can't adjust it because they just don't know how, because whoever they lock the instructions away. You're being given a weapon. Basically, they're treating this like a bullet. That's what they're treating this like. The mechanisms of which you don't need to know. You just need to treat this thing like a bullet, point at something, and fire it. That's not how stuff like this should work. But military stupidity is unfathomable sometimes.
But with an all-out assault by the Japanese underway, shortages or not, the US Navy submariners were going to fire their torpedoes at any targets they could find. This, being basically the first live firing cycle for the Mark 14, was when the problems began to show up.
Hooray!
Within weeks of the start of operations, reports began to come in, and they were not good. Torpedoes were being fired, but ships were rather inconveniently staying afloat. Torpedoes had been observed sailing under ships without exploding. Other times, they were exploding far too early, and still others had ploughed headlong into their targets, with the crash of over a ton of metal slamming into a ship at highway speed, echoing through the ocean and back to the hydrophone operators aboard US submarines. But few, if any, were actually doing their job of exploding on target. More worryingly, a number of submarines were simply vanishing without any sign or report of engagement, either from them or by the enemy. As it turned out, the Mark 14 had more than one problem, but they were stacking on top of each other, which at the start masked the extent of the issue.
Hooray!
On top of this, the Bureau of Ordnance absolutely refused to accept the rising criticism and growing anger of the US submarines' captains.
Of course not. Nothing's ever your fault. Nothing is ever your fault. This is one of those things where I've actually seen this in practice, not on this scale, nowhere near on this scale. But I've seen something so janked, it's just absolutely mind-numbing. And you can't tell them, because they're all high-ranking officers, you can't tell the person involved, no, this is screwed up, we need to fix this, because they are convinced that it works. They are convinced that it works, and they're convinced that they're right, even though they've never done anything with it, they've never put it into practice, they've never done any kind of exercises with it, or seen any way that it could be better. The fight that I had to get my startup sequence changed for the system that I worked on was absurd. Because when I got to my boat, there was a startup sequence for my equipment that was talking about equipment that my system didn't, it just didn't even have. I had to fight for months to get this thing fixed. Enough about my rant about dealing with Navy bureaucracy. Let's go.
Insisting that their wonder weapon was absolutely perfect, and it was in fact the Submariner's fault. They were simply incompetent, Bjord said, and they weren't using the torpedo correctly. They also reiterated that no, there would not be any tests, especially now when torpedoes were being expended faster than they could be produced. This was despite the captains of both USS Sargo and USS Sea Dragon, amongst others, even going so far as to break radio silence in the middle of an operation after having fired dozens of torpedoes in textbook attacks, only to watch the Imperial Japanese Navy's warships and transports that they were targeting serenely sail away into the sunset with nary a scratch of paint on their hulls to show for it. The first suspect wasn't actually the Mark 6 detonator, but rather the Mark 14's torpedo depth setting. Although field fixes had still yielded little in terms of results, these weapons that had been fixed by the crews aboard the submarines were at least scraping paint off of the targets as opposed to motoring along far below bothering the local fish. Bureau of Ordnance's first reaction when they learned of this was to recommend disciplinary action against any US Navy officer who'd made alterations, ostensibly for improper maintenance of the Mark 14, which,
of course they would, and of course they would sit there and talk about maintenance when they don't even provide an operator's manual for this thing.
Continued to insist was absolutely fine. Meanwhile, back in the real world, the newly promoted Rear Admiral Lockwood had taken over command of US submarine efforts in the most active part of the Pacific campaign. With summer of 1942 approaching, his forces had fired off more than a year's production of Mark 14s in around 6 months, and had precious little to show for it. He decided that, Bjord's decree or not, he was going to conduct some tests and get to the bottom of this. USS Skipjack was corralled for the task, and a torpedo with a dummy warhead was dutifully fired at a torpedo net, set for a running depth of 10 feet, with the idea that the torpedo would punch a hole in the net as it passed, showing where the torpedo was actually running.
Right.
As they reeled the net in, 10 foot showed no hole. Then came 15 foot, then 20 foot. Eventually, after 25 feet of netting had come up, a hole was revealed. At that depth, only a heavily loaded battleship would have been hit, and even then a lucky swell might well carry anything short of the Yamato herself clear of such a torpedo.
My God.
2 further tests the following day showed similar results, with the average difference between the depth setting on the torpedo and the actual depth it travelled at being around 11 feet.
Oh my God.
Bjord was absolutely furious that their instructions to not test the torpedo had been disregarded. But unfortunately for them, and fortunately for the US submariners, the news of the tests also got to Admiral King, who was Chief of Naval Operations at the time. And yes, that Admiral King. And if there's one thing King hated more than enemies of the US Navy, or the British, which to his mind sometimes were synonymous, it was people who shortchanged his sailors. Within weeks of the tests, and shortly after a number of visits and letters from Admiral King, Bjord's tone suddenly changed.
Oh, I bet.
It now admitted that, yes, in fact, the torpedo was running deep. And shortly thereafter, one imagines Admiral King standing behind the official and twisting their arm just that little bit further. They admitted that, no, they hadn't actually done any proper design or testing of the depth-keeping device. The reasons for this failure were...
What? Okay.
were manifold, but primarily related to the very few tests that had been done pre-war. In these, a dummy warhead was fitted as previously described, but this warhead was deliberately lighter than the real one. This was so that the torpedo would float to the surface once it ran out of fuel, and thus could be easily recovered. This in turn meant that to run at the desired depth, the torpedo had to correct considerably more downwards than it would have had to do if the real, heavier warhead had been aboard.
Oh my God.
Thus, With the heavier actual explosive in place, the torpedo would force itself deeper than was otherwise desired. This was compounded by a number of other factors. The warhead's size had been slightly increased since the Mark 14 had first been put into service, which made it heavier still, and thus dragged it down further still. Also, the devices used to measure the depth of a test torpedo, both onshore and the recorder built into the weapon, had errors in their design that led to an artificially shallow result being recorded. The onboard depth sensor that fed into the control fins was also compromised by its position. Previous such pressure measuring devices had been mounted along the body of a torpedo, but the Mark 14's was installed on the cone-shaped tail. In this area, where water flowed back around the torpedo, and it was also in the vicinity of the propeller, the local water pressure was somewhat lower than average for the given depth. Thus,
this is a cavalcade of stupidity. This is outrageously stupid. I knew some things about this. But damn, this is just outright the dumbest. They got people killed. Because they didn't want to do their damn job right.
giving the depth control device a falsely shallow reading, and so even deeper the torpedo went. This last was an especially wonderful thing, as this problem would only show up when the torpedo was actually moving. If you simply placed a weapon in a tank at a given depth, it would of course give the correct reading, as the water around it was relatively static. Only a live fire test with a fast-moving torpedo would generate the low-pressure bubble and thus indicate the actual issue.
Right.
Somewhat masked though it may have been by all the other errors in the recording device itself. Still, with this issue now identified, on some US subs the skippers simply dialed the depth setting down to practically nothing. The torpedoes would now at least run at a depth where they should be hitting the target until a more permanent fix, which was moving the depth sensor port back to the middle of the torpedo body, could be implemented on newly built weapons. As the summer of 1942 rolled on, the Mark 14 was now at least roughly the right depth. However, more and more reports were now arriving of weapons that were simply smashing into a target without exploding, or else exploding very short, something which had been present in small amounts earlier, but would now account for the majority of the failures.
Right.
The Imperial Japanese Navy remained irritatingly afloat, with most successes to date credited to the Dutch flotilla, with occasional input from the few British and other Allied Imperial submarines that were still in the operational area.
How frustrating this had to be, I can't even begin to talk to you guys about. How just utterly and completely mind-numbingly frustrating this had to be. And not only that, it had to be terrifying. Because you're out there in a submarine. Cat, I swear to God. You're out there in a submarine. If you take a shot, you stand a high chance of somebody, well, they're going to know you're there the second that you take the shot. There is no way to mask the sound of a torpedo moving through the water. It's too damn loud. Okay? It's too loud. The second that shot is taken, they're going to know. And they're going to know to look for you. So when you take the shot, you're putting yourself at risk. And even if you hit your target, I just, like, the level of rage would be palpable.
Over the next few months, multiple attacks on the Japanese carriers were launched by lucky US submarines, with over a dozen torpedoes having the potential to sink several carriers, ending up simply detonating in open water, along with several others that would hit but didn't explode. and a couple that by some miracle actually did their job and damaged their target somewhat. In that particular case, it was the carrier Hio. But the ship survived, as 2 other torpedoes in the salvo, which likely would have finished it off, completely failed to work. Once again, the initial behind-the-lines belief was that, no, there was no problem, sir. The super-secret magnetic detonator must be working perfectly. After all, we invented it.
Right.
But this was not the case. The magnetic field near the area where initial development trials had been run was somewhat weaker than the magnetic field in the area where the torpedoes were actually being used. And so what was happening now was that with this much stronger magnetic field, the torpedoes were detonating when they detected a disturbance in line with their calibration, except that this disturbance was well before the target. And with the stronger fields tripping the detonator too early, when they worked at all, the torpedo would simply shower the target ship with sea spray. Running the torpedoes
saltwater washdown, there you go.
Somewhat deeper would in theory allow it to get closer, as the overall field strength of the ship would diminish with depth. But nobody was going to set a Mark 14 to run deep again for a little while after the incidents earlier in the war.
Nope.
A year and a half into the conflict, and with little to show for their efforts, US submariners were deactivating the detonators of their own accord against orders, with BUORD experts coming out and issuing reports that once again blamed the crews for not using their weapons properly.
Oh my God!
Despite these same experts making constant mistakes in setting up the torpedoes that they were supposed to know everything about, to the point of the submarine's crews having to correct the experts' work to prevent the subsequent launch, finally resulting in something being sunk, namely the submarine that had just launched the Mark 14. This, in spite of the fact that premature explosions had actually been a known issue to BUORD for about 3 years at this point. But of course, they couldn't be seen to lose face. Finally, almost 2 years in...
I don't... This is really irritating the hell out of me. This is pissing me off for all the wrong reasons. This is pissing me off. Cat, do you mind? What are you doing? Look at this. She done. Look at this. Look. What? Doesn't come up here unless I'm recording. You don't come up here unless I'm recording. You're a fat cat. Fat cat. The utter conviction that you're right, even though all evidence points to the contrary. I've seen this too. I saw this too many times in my military career. Like, I saw this too many times. It's like...
Into the war, reality began to sink in yet again, and orders filtered through the fleet to deactivate the Mark 6 magnetic exploder, with one final holdout, Rear Admiral Christie, finally being overruled by more senior officers.
There you go.
The reason for Christie's refusal? Well, he'd been on the team that had helped to develop the Mark 6 and would sooner believe that his entire command, namely the Australian-based US submarine units, was full of utter rank incompetence, rather than admit he might, in some way, possibly, have made a mistake 2 decades earlier.
Yep, you screwed up.
And so, with the primary detonator deactivated and the depth control issue on its way to being fixed, the remaining issue was that quite a large number of torpedoes were now in fact hitting their targets, but not detonating at all. This made little sense at first because, well, the Mark 14 did have a backup contact detonator. Surely this system couldn't be malfunctioning as well.
It was.
Well, that question could be answered in extreme detail and with a lot of colourful language by the crew of the USS Tinosa, who had come across a Japanese whaling ship and unleashed no fewer than 15 torpedoes into it, scoring 13 hits, enough to put any vessel on the ocean floor, let alone a relatively small 19,000-ton civilian whaling ship. Instead, with only one torpedo left to their name, the crew simply heard clang after crash as duds poked tiny holes in their prey. The last weapon aboard was brought back to port, where Buord dutifully reported that, of course, there was absolutely nothing wrong with it.
Oh yes, nothing wrong.
However, the US Navy's officers were becoming less and less intimidated by Buord's bluster, and more tests were conducted shortly thereafter at Pearl Harbor, involving both firing torpedoes at nearby cliffs as well as dropping torpedo heads off of a gantry onto the ground, with only the contact detonator enabled and no warhead, obviously. What they found was that in almost 3/4 of cases, hits that impacted perpendicular to the target, the ideal angle that US subcommanders were trained to aim for, failed to explode. However, they did also find that impacts at an angle tended to work slightly more often, and so immediate orders were issued to go against pre-war training and try and aim torpedoes to strike targets at an angle. This saw...
Imagine being a sub-commander having to deal with all this garbage. Imagine being a sub-commander having to deal with this level of stupidity. Imagine having to be a submarine crew. Once you sit there and your crew isn't confident they can fire their weapons and the weapons are actually going to work, you got a problem on your hands.
Some improvement at once, but duds were still a major problem. Back ashore, further investigation continued, and what they found was that the contact detonator was a descendant of an older unit that had shown similar problems,
oh my God,
but at a somewhat lower level. This was because, whereas you might imagine that a detonator pin should be in line with the torpedo's direction of travel, in the case of this particular lineage of contact detonators, Buord, in their infinite wisdom, had decided to align the pin at 90 degrees to the line of travel of the torpedo.
What?
So that when the torpedo slammed into a target, the deceleration would force the pin sideways against its mounting, the friction slowing or stopping it from activating completely until the deceleration was over. Unfortunately, the deceleration being over usually corresponded to the entire mechanism being destroyed by the torpedo head smashing itself headlong into the ship's hull. The angled approach had some success.
Who thought of this? Who thought this was a good idea?
Because the impact was spread out over a slightly longer period, and the direction of travel was now slightly closer to the firing pin's line of travel, which reduced the level of friction on the mounting and gave a slightly higher chance for the device to actually work. Although this had been a problem, as mentioned previously, in the older 30-knot Mark X torpedo, the Bureau of Ordnance had simply assumed that using the same, slightly stronger mounting spring that they'd eventually used to solve the problem in the older weapon, the detonator would work absolutely fine at the much higher 46-knot impact speed that the Mark XIV was capable of when fired up close. The idea being that with a more powerful spring, the pin would travel across and detonate before the deceleration could pin it against the side of its mounting. Needless to say, and shockingly enough, they were wrong. And, needless to say, if they'd done some actual testing before the war, this issue, along with all the others, would also have been picked up. A short-term solution was devised by the machinists at Pearl Harbor by replacing the firing pin and other parts related to it with copies that were made of aluminium, the lighter parts having less inertia and thus somewhat less resistance to the spring's sideways movement, even when they were undergoing a high-speed deceleration. In new-build weapons, Buord would grudgingly adopt an electric detonator that was triggered by a simple ball switch. But by now, winter of 1943 approached. Almost 2 years into the war, and the Mark XIV was finally now mostly working. Several thousand torpedoes and dozens of missed targets later. There was still a remaining issue of faulty gyroscopes, sometimes sending the torpedoes spiralling back at the vessels that had launched them.
Yay!
And this appears to have been responsible for at least 2 losses of US submarines, as well as a number of close calls and rather nasty scares. But, to be fair, this was an issue that plagued more than just the Mark XIV, and indeed would show up on occasion in many other navies during the war. And so, whilst this particular failure was especially deadly, and even more so once the Mark 14 actually would start exploding, it was not a particular failing of the Mark 14.
Well, okay.
Now, shockingly, once a torpedo travelled at something resembling the right depth with a detonator that actually worked, the number of vessels that were sunk by US submarines suddenly began to rise.
Oh, hooray.
Helped by the introduction, admittedly, of Torpex in 1942, a new form of explosive that was rather wittingly named Torpex because it was the torpedo explosive, which happened to...
That is absolutely nasty looking. Oh my god.
Give the torpedo a punch about 50% greater than its original TNT warhead had possessed. Indeed, these fixed Mark 14s would bag the single largest warship ever sunk by a submarine when USS Archerfish sent the carrier Shinano to the bottom later in the war. These fixes would also spread out to other weapons. The Mark 13 aerial torpedo, the Mark 15 aboard US destroyers, and the Mark 18 aboard PT boats would all benefit from varying degrees from the solutions that had been arrived at with the Mark 14, since their own issues stemmed from similar design failures by Buord. Ironically enough, the US Navy managed to overcome its bottleneck of torpedo production around the same time that it overcame most of the issues with the Mark 14, and so by the end of the war, huge stockpiles of perhaps the most reworked torpedo in existence were just sitting around. Whilst the Mark 14 would be improved into the Mark 16 post-war, using a number of features taken from German torpedoes, so many Mark 14s remained in stock that they wouldn't actually leave US Navy service until the early 1980s, albeit they were very much a second-line weapon by that point, making this utter disaster of a Buord project eventually morph into what was actually the longest-serving torpedo in US Navy history. The Mark 14 and its questionable capabilities in the first couple of the years of the war remains one of the greatest, if somewhat less known, what-ifs of World War II.
True.
That have a relatively plausible point of change. You see, even a small live-firing test program in the early 1930s might have resulted in the US Navy entering the war with an actually functioning torpedo, instead of the next best thing to sailing up to a target and raising a flag with the word BANG written on it, mounted on a periscope.
Actually, clang would be more appropriate since it kept on bouncing off the hulls.
If this live-fire test program had happened and fixes had been implemented, the Japanese Navy might have found itself quite a few ships short prior even to the battles of Coral Sea and Midway. And even if that somehow didn't change the forces available for those two battles, the Mark 13 aerial torpedo was similarly affected by Buord's curse, and so both the ineffectual Devastator attack using the Mark 13 early on at Midway, as well as the submarine attack on the battlecruiser Kirishima by submarine, might both have borne fruit. Whilst it may seem easy to dismiss Buord's conduct as simply saving money in the interwar period, their continued obstruction of any and all attempts to solve the problems once the war began likely delayed the devising and implementation of solutions by a considerable amount of time. Depending on the source, this is rated at least months, possibly even up to a year or so. The cost in time, effort, and of course lives of servicemen failed by their weapons, all caused by this practically unforgivable behaviour by Buord, cannot be overlooked, and definitely...
The thing that I want to know is, were there any court-martials after this?
Should not be forgotten.
That's it for this video.
Court-martials should have happened over this. A lot of court-martials. To sit there and have your entire fleet saying that this thing doesn't work. To have your entire fleet saying, hey, this isn't functioning the way you say it should, and then to sit there and turn around and be like, oh, everybody sucks. It's not our fault. It's not our fault that you don't know what you're doing. I had this just I had a guy I served with, and he was a first class. He was on his way out the door, and he was just, to call him a piece of work is understating the matter. He was a real piece of work. But he also didn't know what he was doing. And it took him shoving his foot so far down his throat in a very public manner for people to see that. He hated me. I still to this day don't quite know why. He hated me. And he just had this thing where he would, every day when I'd come up for watch, he'd have the system in a reserve state. And it would be locked up. And of course, I was to blame. Now, when I would stand my watch, nothing would happen to the system. But when he would go on his watch, the system would break. And the reason it would break is because he was up there screwing with it. And time after time, I'm up there getting yelled at because there's obviously something wrong with my system, and I'm just too incompetent to figure it out. When I know what's going on with my system, Petty Officer First Class Chucklefuck is up here screwing up and messing with all of my systems and putting them in a reserve status because he wants to just sit there and screw around. And at every single point, I would be told that I didn't know what I was talking about, that I didn't know what I was doing, until one day he screwed up very publicly when we were having an exercise getting ready to be put together. And I was woken up at about 3 o'clock in the morning when they were getting ready to start this exercise. And I was dressed down in front of quite literally my entire chain of command, except my captain. And my chief is sitting there telling me I don't know what I'm doing, like just in front of everybody, in front of everyone. I don't know what I'm doing. I have no idea blah, blah, blah this, blah, blah, blah that. My stuff's always broken. I need to learn how to maintain my stuff better, all this other kind of stuff. And of course, I'm just sitting there taking it because this is something that I've said about a dozen times that week alone. And I have told them the startup procedures didn't work. I have told them all this other kind of stuff, but they don't want to believe you. Because, so-and-so who's been in the Navy like 16 years, he said this should work, so it should work. Well, I'm sorry, it doesn't work. So he just sits there, he's like, well, I'll do this. He grabs his little manual that I know is busted. And, long story short, this guy goes down there 3 times. Now, my weapons officer, he was a guy that used to work on my exact equipment. So he knew. He had first-hand experience with dealing with stupidity, the kind of likes that which I dealt with. And so finally, he looked at me after the first time the guy came back up and couldn't get the stuff restarted because the guy was trying to king shits me. He looked at me the first time. I just shook my head no. He looked at me the second time, and then I said, "All right, can I go take care of this stuff right now? Can I go get my stuff online? Because I should be asleep for another 4 hours. Because I just got off watch 2 hours ago. He's already managed to screw this. Can I go take care of this?" Went down there, powered everything up in under 2 minutes. Came back up, got everything set back up, integrated it into the test platform for everybody else, and he's just standing up there. And everybody's got their foot in their mouth who thought I was an incompetent. And the reason that everything was going the way it was is because Chucklefuck was messing with everything and putting things into modes where he didn't even know what they did. Sorry for the irritation, but I've dealt with crap like this. I dealt with where, because someone is higher ranked than you, they automatically assume that you're a bleeding moron because this person can't possibly be wrong. I dealt with this for a while, to the point where it was getting obscene, and I regretted going to that ship so many times just because of the first year and change that I was on it, having to deal with that person who was higher ranked than me, yes, but grossly incompetent at their job. Rant off. Warpugs, I'm going to let you guys go. The pugs are sounding off. All Drachinifel's links are going to be in the description down below. Please go check him out. Okay, this was exactly what you guys said it was. It was going to irritate me, and yes, it did irritate me because I've dealt with this not at this scale, but I've dealt with this type of stupidity before. Check the links in the description down below. Like, comment, subscribe, or post. I am out. Sing the song of my people.